Hi, everyone. I wanted to post a quick lecture at the end of this week just to kind of try to bring some of your readings together and maybe highlight a few things that I want you to focus on as we kind of progress in the class. First, though, a quick apology. Sorry about some of the confusion in some of the readings and their availability through the library's website. We're still working on Ethics for a Brave New World. So, what I did was create a PDF of the chapter and I posted it in last week's class. So, it's available to you. In that chapter, it's important to highlight the different approaches to just war theory and the different criteria that Feinberg and Feinberg articulate on what constitutes a just war. So you want to take a look at that, and you want to read their argument. And of course, they are just war theorists, and are making an argument against pacifism. And then in your book by Friesen, Christian Peacemaking and International Conflict, you get a Mennonites theologian's argument for pacifism. And so you've already read part one of that, which kind of gives a theological framework for his argument. And then the next parts you'll be reading will be kind of a practical framework for how to live out his perspective on pacifism. So I want to give both of those to you as a way to frame this class. What we're talking about in peacemaking is both pacifists and just war theorists at their best are trying to create a more peaceful world. And so understanding each of those perspectives and each of those arguments and what it means to how they kind of fit in understanding what is our faithful way to follow Jesus when it comes to using violence to accomplish a good end, like using violence for justice or using violence to protect an innocent person. And so that's the motivation is at its best is to promote peace. And we read Stassen's article on the 14 Triads of the Sermon on the Mount. And the thing that I want to highlight there is in his argument about interpreting the Sermon on the Mount, what he wants to do is anchor our interpretation in grace-based transforming initiatives. And so he wants it to be very practical and concrete application of Jesus' teaching. And he thinks that Jesus' teaching is something concrete and something that can be lived out, which if you look at the history of interpreting the Sermon on the Mount and applying it to our own lives, there's been radical differences in interpretation. One is a very legalistic interpretation of like blessed are the poor, which means that all Christians should take a vow of poverty, to almost a dismissal of the Sermon on the Mount, that it was for a different age at a different time. And so what Glenn wants to do is he wants to take those teachings of Jesus, and really what he does in his book Kingdom Ethics is expand those to say this is the foundation for Christian ethics. And so what I want to do really quickly is just highlight a couple of principles from his article and how it applies to our conversation in Christian ethics. So the Sermon on the Mount represents Jesus' teachings. So we're looking closely at that, and you read that article. And as you read it, I think several principles come out and emerge from Jesus' teaching on the Sermon on the Mount that are helpful in our conversation on peacemaking. And I'm going to highlight a few of them. The first one is the principle of inclusion. The Beatitudes, loving our enemies. Our ethics should pay attention to the marginalized in society, those that are considered outcast and oppressed. So the principle here is that the kingdom of God is shockingly available to a wider swath of people than what we imagine. And so that should push the boundaries of our ethical concern and our moral concern outward farther than what we normally do. And Jesus does that. He teaches us to do that. The second principle is a reconciliation and peacemaking, which has its practical application here in this class. So he talks about the traditional righteousness. You shall not kill, traditional righteousness about divorce, the lex talionis, the eye for an eye, loving your enemy and not judging. And the practices of reconciliation that he talks about are really important. First of all, he talks about being reconciled. This is one of the things that we do when somebody has something against us, as we do our part to work towards reconciliation. The other couple of practices are turn the other cheek and going the extra mile, which I will post an article you'll read in Transforming Violence, how Walter Wink brings those together and shows us that that's not a kind of pacifism or a kind of just letting go, but it's actually a way to assert your dignity in the midst of oppression. So I think you'll find that article interesting. And then another practice of reconciliation is loving your enemy and praying for them. And finally, and really importantly, is in Matthew 7, taking the log out of your own eye. So the practice of self-reflection before judgment of another. And so those are the practices of reconciliation and peacemaking. We have practices of integrity, that the outside matches the inside, and there's several different ways that we talk about that. So that's what I wanted to highlight from Stassen's article. The next thing that I want to do is try to bring together for you Michael Walzer's argument in Just and Unjust Wars, and then Feinberg and Feinberg's argument in Ethics for a Brave New World, and talk about the three just war criteria, or three just war principles. And what I mean by that is Feinberg and Feinberg give you two, the justice of war and the justice in war. So fighting a just war requires that you meet the criteria for entering into that war, and then fighting a just war requires that you meet the criteria of fighting in that war. And I think what the interesting thing is that Walzer adds a third criteria, or a third principle here. So there's justice of war, that's jus ad bellum in Latin. Justice in war, that's jus in bello. And then what Walzer adds is justice after war, jus post bellum. So I want to highlight this because the criteria for justice of war and justice in war are laid out in your Ethics for a Brave New World, and Walzer lays out the just post bellum in his book Just and Unjust War. So these are the criteria for justly ending a war, which is really important. The first one is do everything possible to ensure that the post-war regime be a government of, by, and for the indigenous people. The second one is that having fought the war, we are now responsible for the well-being of the people who have been defeated. We need to provide the resources necessary for the security and political and economic restructuring of the country. That means self-determination, popular legitimacy, that people have a say in who's governing them, civil rights, promoting civil rights, and working for the common good. And then finally, we want wars to end with governments in power in the defeated states that are chosen by the people. And so that's an important aspect of just war theory that Feinberg and Feinberg just don't cover. And then I'm going to post an article by David Gushee on the difference between soft just war theory and hard just war theory that you're going to want to take a look at and know the distinctions of that, especially for the conversation in our class, but also for the exam. So you'll want to know the different, in Feinberg and Feinberg, the four different types of pacifism: universal pacifism, Christian pacifism, private pacifism, and anti-war pacifism. And then you're going to want to know Gushee's distinctions between soft just war theory and hard just war theory. And so those are the things and I will post that article this week, at the end of this week in our class.